Doctor Sleep is a 2019 horror drama directed by Mike Flanagan, the man who brought us the recent Netflix Haunting of House Hill series. It's an adaptation of the recent Stephen King novel, which in itself is a sequel to King's The Shining. Now, the first question, obviously, is whether Doctor Sleep is a sequel to the book or the film, both of which I've seen and read, and both of which are very different beasts entirely, with King very famously hating Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation. I think the film has tried to act as a companion piece to both, but it definitely favours the film, because there's a few things that just don't marry up with the Shining book, and in fact it actually uses elements from the plot of the book anyway. It works a lot better when you think of it as a sequel to the movie, and it doesn't in any way try to hide it. The story involves young Danny from the original film, now played by Ewan McGregor, all grown up and living alone after the death of his mother. And he's drunk, he's disturbed, and he's just trying to find a foothold in life. He obviously still has his shining ability, but never uses it. He gets a job at a hospital for the elderly, or those dying of terminal disease. I don't remember exactly what it was. And he finds he's actually able to use his shining ability to help these old folk in their last moments, to give them a bit of peace and solace. And in doing so, he himself gets some peace. However, soon he is caught up in a mission to save a young girl who also shines from a sadistic group who prey on young children's shines, what they call steam, to prolong their life. It's a horrible process, shown in full at one point in the movie, where they get together and torture young kids whom they've kidnapped, tying them up and repeatedly stabbing and slicing them, and sucking in the steam that emits from their victims' mouths. Danny's journey with the young girl also involves him revisiting demons from his past and bringing the entire story full circle, even taking a trip back to the Overlook Hotel. Doctor Sleep wears its shining apparel proudly on its sleeves. It's unashamedly and bold in mimicking the colour scheme of the original movie, the musical cues, having the character revisit places where classic scenes took place, and even, shockingly, recasting the trio from the original movie, Jack Nicholson included, with lookalike actors for scenes that are remade and additional parts exploring Danny's youth. It is pretty weird to see that in a big budget mainstream Hollywood production. What you're seeing is essentially a Jack Nicholson impersonator in a Jack Torrance costume and things like that. Many of the links to the original film, like the bright and saturated colour palette, are welcome, because it sets a level of consistency with The Shining and Doctor Sleep, and it is very interesting to see what happened to Danny and how The Shining affects him. However, I think the movie goes too far in places, whether it's the filmmakers trying to evoke a nostalgia, or because they themselves were so obsessed with the original film. Whatever, it's too much. On a technical level, it's great. I love the way they recreated the Overlook Hotel, and I think they did a brilliant job with the details. But Doctor Sleep is definitely at its strongest when it's doing its own thing, when it's being its own movie, and not a sequel to The Shining. The more and more it started to go back to the 1980 film, the more it began to lose its own identity. Ironically, I thought the parts that hark back to The Shining were the least interesting aspects of the film, looking back. This new thing with the child killers was very interesting, and a lore worth exploring. We just don't know how long they've been around. One of the older ones is said to have been doing his thing even back when the Romans were around, and yet they don't look ghoulish and creepy. There's a hippie vibe about them, an unconventional look for movie bad guys, but it does actually add to the charm. Look at Rebecca Ferguson. She doesn't at all look like a child eater, especially in the film with her magician's hat, but that's one of the reasons why I feel the bad guys in the film work, even though they look like a group of misfit Vietnam War protesters from the late 60s. Just out of interest, did anyone else get a pedo vibe coming from them? There's definitely elements of that, and as such it makes the baddies seem a lot more disgusting. Doctor Sleep provides a lot more structure to The Shining as a concept, and the magical elements of the film's universe. Whereas in the original film it seemed the hotel erupted into surreal chaos towards the end, and much of the horror comes from the fact that we don't quite understand what's going on, here they provide reasoning, rationale and logic for many of the different spooky elements. The Shining here in this film is a more straightforward concept to understand, and characters utilize it to greatly benefit them. I think this could be a turn-off for many people, but for me it was one of the things I found interesting, even though it did make The Shining as a concept seem more like generic superpowers than the strange thing it was in the original film. I really liked what the film did with its visuals. It was very creative in that department. There's one scene which I thought was brilliant, where one of the bad guys uses her powers to kind of sail above the clouds in her mind as she tracks one of her victims. And as she narrows in and gets closer and closer, the way the camera and background all moves around Inception style was really cool. Astral projection, I think it's called, what was happening in this scene. I haven't read Doctor Sleep, but I have read a fair bit of Stephen King, and sometimes his writing can contain a lot of abstract ideas, a lot of weird stuff that you don't necessarily think would be able to work in film. Some of the stuff you see in Doctor Sleep feels like that, like it was making sense of and visualizing some crazy idea a coked up Stephen King was thinking at the time, and I think it did it very well. It was a very long film. Online it says the movie is about 2.5 hours long, but the version I watched was 3 hours, so I must have watched an extended cut or a director's cut or something. It's also really slow paced, drawn out, and has a somber tone, so it can be quite challenging for audiences to sit through. I didn't mind the length though, but at the same time, the story doesn't merit its epic length. It's quite a straightforward story really, about a dude with special powers helping a kid with special powers against a child murdering cult. The Shining connection could be seen as kicking the film's pedigree up a notch, but not really, if we're honest, a necessary element of the film. Overall, I think it's a pretty decent movie. There isn't much to the story, it's pretty simple, but enjoyable nonetheless. I give it a 7 out of 10.